landscape is almost a self-explanatory phrase, but really what it means is looking at the landscape and understanding what is here and why it's here. And I said this morning that there's an awful lot about ecology that we don't understand. Well, this afternoon I'm going to focus on the things that we do understand. And a lot of that is looking at different plants and seeing what's the significance of seeing this plant here. Some plants will grow anywhere, other plants will only grow in certain soils or certain situations, and so they tell you something. Also looking at different processes and the ways in which different plants are growing and all that kind of stuff. History, landscape history comes into it, but that's only one part of it. There is of course an aspect of pure joy in the beauty of it. Let's go. We can open this. Last person through, please shut the gate. Okay, one thing you can notice about this hedge is that there are lots of different kinds of shrubs in it. And you don't actually need to be able to identify them and put a name to them in order to see that there are lots. So you see over there, that's the ash, which is normally a tree, but here it's been kept to shrub size by being in the hedge. And then this one is different. You see a completely different kind of leaf. It's the sycamore. This actually is garden privet, which is a curiosity. You don't normally see it in country hedges, but just round here somebody must have planted it at some time. This is the native maple, like the sycamore, but it's different. That is not a shrub, that's bryony, black bryony. It's a climber, that's not counted. What I mean by counted, I'll say in a moment. Bramble is not counted either, but here, this is hawthorn, and that's dogwood, like this, which he's got in his garden, and you can use this for weaving baskets, and it's got lovely red wood. It's got a very distinctive leaf pattern, the way the veins go in the leaf. This is elm. And, oh gosh, I could talk about elm for ages. One of the characteristics of elm, of almost all elms, is that the base of the leaf is asymmetric. So you can see, you see that? This side is higher than that side is lower than, can you see that? We can pass that one round. Or any of these elm leaves.
Elm.
Yeah. Elm is a common species in hedges because it suckers. That means the roots actually put up new plants. So you get new plants not just from seed, in fact, not from seed at all with this kind of elm, but growing from the roots. And that makes it very successful in a hedge, because it can reproduce in a hedge. You imagine a little seed landing in the middle of there and trying to germinate and grow. It's got no chance at all. But a young plant that originates from the root of a mother plant has got the whole of the energy of the mother plant to support it. So it's got some chance of actually getting going and living in a hedge like this. And so you can get hedges which are pure elm. And that is probably, probably didn't start like that, but over the years, elm has been able to reproduce and the other ones haven't. And bit by bit, as the centuries go by, the elm takes over. This kind of elm, the suckering elm, suffers from Dutch elm disease, but Dutch elm disease only comes when the stem is a certain diameter, when the beetles which spread the disease start infecting, getting in under the bark. And because this is constantly trimmed, they never get to that size, so they don't catch the disease. And as we go along, in this hedge, which I'm very familiar with, there's something like 9 or 10 different species of trees and shrubs. And there used to be a theory that if you count the number of, well, it still is current, if you count the number of different trees and shrub species in a 30-metre stretch, that will tell you the age of the hedge in centuries. In fact, it doesn't work. There are too many exceptions. But it's a nice thought. It's great fun to go along and count the number of species in a hedge and just imagine who were the people who planted this hedge? How long ago was it? What kind of clothes were they wearing? What kind of tools were they using? Why did they plant it? And you know, the very oldest hedges weren't even planted. Those were where people were carving fields out of the wildwood, and they would just leave a line of trees and shrubs where they wanted a hedge. So those are really ancient. And of course the most recent ones tend to be just hawthorn, pure hawthorn, the 19th century. Actually, I tell a lie, those are not the most recent ones. The most recent ones are ones planted by people like me who say, oh, now let's have a nice diverse hedge with lots of different native species. And then, of course, that completely throws this business of counting the number of species. So this whole business of seeing a lot of different species in the hedge, earlier on I was talking about it being a factor of the age of the hedge. It's also a factor of the soil. It means that we must be on an alkaline soil. So if we were in an acid region, wouldn't matter how old the hedge was, you still wouldn't have this same number of species in it. Because, and this is one of the facts of ecology which I've never seen an explanation for anywhere, but the fact is there's a wider diversity of plants that grow on alkaline soil than there is on acid soil. And that applies to trees, shrubs, flowers, grasses, whatever kind of plants you're talking about. There's a wider range, more potential diversity on an alkaline soil. We're not doing a lot of walking, are we? But we will in a bit. More of a stand than a walk. This tree, this is an ash tree. Someone's allowed it to grow up as a standard tree within the hedge. And it's interesting, you can see how this lower part of it has got no branches on at all. And then once you get above the height of the hedge, it starts branching out immediately. Now, you imagine you're a timber merchant and you want to buy a tree to saw up into planks. You know, how much of this is going to interest you? Yeah, it's just the bottom bit. And so, in order to grow good timber in a hedge, what you actually need to do is to prune it. And people don't bother these days, you know, because the value of one single tree on its own is not economic. Timber merchants won't look at anything less than a 20-ton load at one time. So nobody's going to bother to prune this unless they do it out of love. But it's very characteristic of how trees relate to each other. So you'd get the same in a coppice with standards woodland. You'd get this same relationship between the coppice trees and the standard tree would have a clean trunk up to the height of the coppice, and then above that you get branches. But then in a timber plantation, where all the trees are planted for timber, that is for tall single-stemmed trees, they draw each other up. And so in a good timber plantation, you'll get lots of tall trees with a clean stem quite high up, as long as the plantation has been well managed. Whereas in parkland, where trees grow on their own, you get a very short but thick trunk and lots of wide branches. And of course, if you're growing a tree for nuts or fruit, that's what you want, because you want a lot of branches. If you're growing for timber, you want to grow them close together. Boom. Boom. Okay, can anyone tell me what's happened to this tree? Pollarded. And what do we mean by pollard?
Coppicing each other ground.
That's right. Yeah. And why do people pollard rather than coppice? Grazing. Yeah, it's up out of the reach of animals. Because if it was pollarded, when those tender little shoots come up in the first year after coppicing, they would all get eaten, repeatedly, eaten, and the tree would die. So in areas where you have grazing animals, so out in the fields, by the riversides, places like that, in hedgerows, if you want a regular crop of poles, which is what you get from pollarding, from coppicing, you pollard instead. And it's very characteristic of willow. Traditionally, willow was used to make thatching spars, those big staples that you use to hold the thatch on the roof. I used to do it myself at one time. Woods are sited in places that are difficult for agriculture. Woods are not sited in places that are particularly suitable for trees, because trees are undemanding plants. It doesn't mean that they're not valuable. In medieval times, woodland was often more valuable than arable land, but it was always sited in the less favourable places. because trees are undemanding. So you can grow as good trees on a place that's poorly drained or steep as you can on a place where you could grow arable crops.
What defines from a tree to a shrub or vice versa?
Yeah. It's not a very clear distinction. Botanically, a shrub has multiple stems and a tree has only one stem.
Yeah.
So by that definition, hazel is a shrub and rosemary is a tree.
Affected by wind, lightning?
It's another pollard. It's an old pollard, and you can tell that because all the branches start from the same place.
Yeah.
The reason why it's hollow is because pollarding a tree increases its life. Because every time you pollard the tree, you're putting it back to a younger stage of development. So you're constantly knocking it back, knocking it back, knocking it back. It's the same with coppicing. You know, an ash tree can live for about 200 years as a maiden, can live for 1,000 years as a coppice stool. There's an old saying, cut them in May and they're here to stay, cut them in June and they'll be back soon, but cut them in July and they're sure to die. You know about hedge laying?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
It's a way of maintaining a hedge, because what tends to happen with a hedge is it all grows up tall and it gets thin at the bottom and thick at the top, which is the opposite of what you want. So traditionally what we do is cut through the stem of each shrub or tree 3/4 of the way through. It can still live like that because it's still just under the bark is where all the vital organs are, and you've left enough of those for it to continue living. Bend it over to an angle of about 30 degrees from the ground, and you bend them all over like that. Well, you remove quite a few of them, but the nice straight ones you bend over, and that makes a compact hedge which is thick at the bottom, and they tend to sprout again from the root, and that renovates the hedge without completely removing it. You know, you could coppice it, but by laying it like that, you still have a usable hedge. And also those branches at 30 degrees are sort of ideally angled to stop animals that want to get through. There are young shoots growing up vertically from that laid bough, and also if we could trace it back to its base, you would see that it's also regrown from the rootstock. And here is a young hawthorn plant which may well have been planted at the time the hedge was laid, because people sometimes do that. If it's a bit thin, they'll pop in a few extra plants.
So would you lay any hedging plant?
More or less any. Elder doesn't lay. If you get elder, you cut it down to ground level. Some are easier to lay than others. What you'd normally do is you take out the big ones, the crooked ones, or the ones that are in the wrong place, and you leave yourself just the really nice ones, and then lay them. It's a lovely job. I love doing it. Oh, my favourite job. Yeah, stinging nettles. Now, you may remember earlier on I was talking about niche and how you get diversity through differentiation of niche. I was talking about it with respect to squirrels and woodpeckers. It's just the same with plants. You get lots of different plants. In a meadow, you'll get, you know, tall plants, short plants, early season plants, late season plants, climbers, semi-parasites, all sorts of different ones occupying all sorts of different niches. Now here we have just 100% nettles, which seems to contradict what we niche theory. Now the reason for that is they're very, very competitive. And wherever you get an unusually high level of nutrients in the soil, nettles or some other very competitive plant is liable to take over. And so, because they grow very fast, they grow very tall, they've got big horizontal leaves which cast a lot of shade. And so they're able to outcompete almost everything else. Not entirely, but to a great extent. So you get a nettle bed. And because they've got the competitive niche, which is means that, you know, that they make their living by actually being bigger and faster growing than anything else, but they can only do it where there is an unusually high level of nutrients. Reeds are another example. You know, reeds in reed beds, where you get sort of shallow water and the reeds growing up through, masses of nutrients, masses of water, they can outcompete all comers. You get the 100% reeds. This actually is a badger set. There's a badger set in the back there. You often find nettles and elder growing around badger sets. I don't know quite why. They certainly don't poo near their sets. They poo far away. Maybe they pee just outside the sets. I suspect that they do, because you often see these. Elder is another indicator of high nutrients. You often get them. And so if you look in a semi-natural grassland, for example, you'll see there are masses and masses of different plants all occupying different niches. If we went out there, probably not a particularly diverse grassland, but we would find a lot. And that is two approaches to life and growing things. One is very high input and a monoculture. The other is a more moderate level of input and a diverse polyculture. And a polyculture is successful, it's productive by occupying different niches and thus sharing out the resources. And we had a bit of this when I was talking about diversity on the first day, where, you know, you had the tall sweet corn and the squash down below it, which is short and bushy. They're sharing the resource of space. You can have an early season variety and a late season variety. They're sharing the resource of time. And our culture has gone down the route of the nettle and the reed bed, the route of putting in masses and masses of resources and getting a very high yield with the monoculture. And what we need to do is to move more towards the species-rich meadow, where we have a complex polyculture making the maximum use of both time and space. You know, the walnut and the wheat, that's another example, where the wheat is growing in the autumn and then in the early spring. Late spring, the walnut comes into leaf and it stays into leaf long after the wheat has stopped doing photosynthesis in August. So you're making more complete use of the whole year. And the same thing underground. You get the deep roots of the walnut going down below the wheat, catching any nutrients that the wheat might have missed. All these interactions are the kind of thing we need to design into our permaculture in the future, because we're not going to be able to do this anymore. You know, we're running out of phosphorus, we're running out of the energy with which we make the nitrogen.